Hi guys, now I hope we've had a chance to have a look at the musical. If not, remember you can just take it in stages because we're going to be focusing on the opening for the next few classes anyway. Okay, so don't worry about that too much. Now, the first thing you notice, of course, when you're viewing it is that it is not a sung through musical. Okay, so think about it. Quite a lot of Andrew Lloyd Webber musicals are sung through musicals. Okay, if you think of something like Cats or Evita, with Vita Peron, obviously set in Argentina, that's a sung through musical. So every single line then is actually sung. So if you think about it, most musicals will be a combination then of dialogue and song. Okay, you kind of think about Les Mis, for example, is more or less a sung through musical, really, isn't it? Maybe one or two dialogue sort of pieces, one or two we'd say kind of fragments or sentences, but in the main, then everything is sung. Okay, so Blood Brothers. What I'm using is I'm just using the Kindle version, okay, which is kind of easier just for scrolling through and so on. There is a PDF that's available online. You could have a look at that. It might be a bit difficult to read in stages, but remember that we're not reading the whole play anyway. It's only the opening, the ending, and then one other key scene essentially that we're looking at as well. Okay, so if we're looking at the title itself, Blood Brothers, okay, first of all, it has just kind of two different connotations. The first one is just kind of biological brothers. So obviously, brothers who are related, okay, so actual familial brothers. And basically, that's what we have when it comes to our two main characters, Mickey and Edward. Also, though, Blood Brothers relates back to that particular ritual that is associated with friends. Usually, boys it's associated with rather than girls. So it's kind of the idea that firm friends feel so close and so intimate, essentially, and rely on each other so much that they regard each other as family. And there's a very particular ritual that kind of goes back to ancient times where they would literally, of course, get a knife or sharp implement and would cut through the skin and the palm of their hands. And then they would literally force the palms together and the blood would commingle essentially. And then they would refer to each other as a blood brother essentially. So it's kind of emphasizing a sense of unity, a sense of harmony, the strong bond that they share, and the ritual or the custom then would sort of cement that. So you'll find that in kind of initiation ceremonies in various tribes or groups or communities around the world throughout human history. So essentially, it can be seen as something we'd say of kind of like a playground ritual, we say for small boys who do it, or it can be seen as part of an ancient ritual or custom then when it comes to human history. Okay, so that's where the title originates from. Okay, and the play itself was first performed in 1983, so it was written around 1981, 1982 by Willy Russell, who is a Liverpudlian playwright or dramatist. And he's most famous then for, we'd say, Educating Rita and also Shirley Valentine. Okay, so they're sort of like two straightforward plays as such. Okay, so not musicals. Okay, it's also been dubbed a Liverpudlian West Side Story. Now, if you know anything about West Side Story, obviously very famous musical with Sondheim music and lyrics. So it's set in New York. Okay, it's a famous film, of course, as well. And you have two warring factions or two gangs essentially who despise each other. Now that sounds very familiar because obviously West Side Story has been inspired by, yes, the tragedy of Romeo and Juliet. You have the Montagues versus the Capulets when it comes to the families who despise each other. And then obviously that has inspired West Side Story, and it has inspired our own novel then, Noughts and Crosses, and indeed it has inspired Blood Brothers as well. Now, Blood Brothers, of course, is not just a musical, as I've mentioned on numerous occasions, it is also a tragedy. Now, if we think about a tragedy, of course, nowadays we seem to think that the word tragedy just means a catastrophic event, a disaster, something terrible has befallen someone, something awful has happened. But it is a very specific genre, remember, we've looked at that before. The idea then that it goes back to, or we can trace its origins to ancient Greece in terms of the different genres or types of drama. So it is the opposite of comedy. Comedy is kind of light-hearted and humorous and frothy, perhaps whimsical. And then we think of tragedy as dark and forbidding. So what are the elements of tragedy? Well, you need a tragic hero. So you have the main character then, who is essentially decent. But that particular character has a fatal flaw. So if we think about Mickey and Edward, of course, they are sort of essentially twin tragic heroes in a very literal sense. They have quite a lot of similarities, but they also have, of course, quite a number of differences as well. So we have to kind of identify, okay, what is the fatal flaw? And then they have to suffer as a result of that. And they have to learn, of course, and be redeemed in some way. But then at the very end of the play, they die. So we see, of course, at the very beginning of the play that we have the reenactment of their deaths. And that's very, very important because we more or less have the same when it comes to the beginning of Romeo and Juliet, where the prologue announces to the audience at the very beginning of the play, a pair of star-crossed lovers take their life. So we know, of course, from the very beginning of the play, before the plot actually delineates or shows us on stage what's going to happen, that basically Romeo and Juliet end up dead by the end of the play. Okay, so that's kind of relating back to the notion then of a tragedy. Okay, so what I want to do is I just want to have a look at the introduction as written by Willy Russell, the playwright himself. And that helps us then to focus on the context. And remember, of course, these would be the basic stage directions as well. Then I'm just going to have a quick look at the main characters and then a very quick look at the plot as well, just so we can familiarize ourselves with this. Okay, so if we're looking at Blood Brothers, then the production note says the setting for Blood Brothers is an open stage. So you can ask yourself, okay, what's an open stage? It's not a very traditional stage. It's almost like an open plan. You don't have a curtain or anything, so you don't get the curtains kind of swishing over and back. Open stage literally is what is also known as a thrust stage. So what you have essentially is you have the audience at the front of the stage, okay, just below the apron, but you also have the audience on either side of the stage as well. So basically you have the audience then on three sides, and then the fourth side then extends back towards the backdrop and backstage. Okay, so if you think about it very, very simply, then it creates a much more intimate connection between the actors and the audience. And therefore, of course, the audience feel more engaged and they feel more involved in the action on stage. Remember the last day I was talking about suspension of disbelief and how vital, how essential that is when it comes to the theatre, that you buy into the performance and you have to convince yourself that what is happening on stage is actually real. So if you think about an open stage, then a thrust stage, one that extends out into the audience essentially, goes a long way in helping the audience to relate to the plot and the characters and helps them to understand the theme. So much more intimate, and it's also much more involving and much more dramatic as well. Okay, so that kind of makes sense then that he would do that, because after all, it is a very personal story and it's about family and it's about friendship. And it's also, of course, about kind of great, kind of lofty themes like class and nature versus nurture and so on as well. But at the heart, at the beating heart of the play is essentially, of course, the relationship between the two brothers, Mickey and Edward. Okay, so we have the open stage then with the different settings and time spans being indicated by lighting changes, because lighting obviously is very important in terms of atmosphere and mood, with the minimum of properties and furniture. And remember, that's going to be very important because you have to allow for the swift changes essentially when it comes to Blood Brothers. You can't have people just kind of traipsing onto stage and then basically lugging large bits of furniture off stage. It's just not going to work. It really isn't, because you need that kind of smooth transition then between the scenes as such too. So he says then very specifically, the whole play should flow along easily and smoothly with no cumbersome scene changes. Cumbersome just means awkward. Okay, so it should be very easy and fluid, essentially. Two areas are semi-permanent, the Lyons House and the Johnston House. Okay, so remember that the Johnston House, of course, Mrs. Johnston, is in a working class area. We never get to see the inside of that particular house, and we have to kind of ask ourselves why that is. We hear the children calling out to Mrs. Johnston when she's on the doorstep or when she's on the street, but we're never actually invited into the house. So we have to kind of think about why that is. Then on the other side of the stage, we have Mrs. Lyons' house. And it's very important because Mrs. Johnson goes to clean in Mrs. Lyons' house. So Mrs. Lyons then, of course, is the middle class woman who's very well-to-do, very comfortable, quite wealthy, essentially. And we do get to see the interior of her house because that's very important in reinforcing her character and, of course, some of the themes of the play, including class and classism. Okay, also we have to remember, of course, that we do have downstage and we have upstage, and then we have stage right and stage left. Now, when we're talking about stage right and stage left, remember, and I may have mentioned this the last day, it is from the actor's perspective. So stage left is when you're standing on stage facing the audience. It's your left as an actor. And then stage right is your right as an actor, not as an audience member. So we do have to remember that then in terms of positioning and blocking, of course, where the actors are on stage as such. Okay, so he describes then, we see the interior of the Lyons' comfortable home, but usually only the exterior front door of the Johnston house, with the interior scenes taking place outside the door, as I've mentioned. The area between the two houses acts as a communal ground, so it could be sort of like community, common as well, for street scenes, park scenes, etc. Okay, so the pace can be quite frenetic at times, and we do see some of the actors doubling up essentially as well. So you have to have that smooth transition. It's not very static or kind of lumpy or leaden. You have to have a lot of movement on stage, and you tend to find that when it comes to a musical as well, even if it is a tragedy, as we'll see here. Okay, right, so they just give you the list then basically of the players or the actors, obviously, and then of course the cast then for the original in this particular one. So we actually have a limited number of characters here, but we do have quite a lot of foils. Remember, I've used that word before, contrasting characters, and that's very important. Okay, so the first character we're introduced to, of course, is Mrs. Johnson. Okay, so Mrs. Johnson, and think about it, she's always called Mrs. Johnson or sometimes Mrs. J, but never use her real or first name, essentially, here when we think about it. There's something very specific about that. Does it relate back to class, perhaps? Does it relate back to how women were viewed at that particular time? Is her role as a mother, as a wife, more important, perhaps, than the actual traits and characteristics? An actual character as such there too. So Mrs. Johnson, remember, is the biological mother of the twins. So the twins are Mickey and Edward. At the very beginning then, we learn that her husband has deserted her, that she has given birth to 7 children, and she is now pregnant with twins. Okay, later on then in terms of the plot, obviously it becomes more complicated, involving Mrs. Lyons. So we see, of course, that poverty is constantly undermining her efforts then to look after her children and provide a safe and secure home for them. Okay, we can see that she has a very specific job. She's a cleaner then for Mrs. Lyons. And just in terms of, we'd say, her characteristics or traits, we can see that she's quite a practical person, that she's quite resilient as such, but she's also superstitious. And that plays a very important part in the play when we're looking at the theme of fate or destiny. That she, of course, really relies on luck or fortune quite a lot. And it also influences the plot in terms of how she behaves towards both Mickey and Edward. That's going to be very important too when we look at how it influences the plot in terms of the character's behaviour and motivations, and then exactly how the tragedy unfolds at the very, very end of the play. So Mrs. Johnson then, very typical working class woman then from Liverpool. And remember, of course, that when you're watching the Theatre Inc. production, the accents are on the ropey side, especially when it comes to the Liverpudlian or Scouser, or Scouse accent, I should say. because remember that that is a high school production. Remember, of course, in North America as well. So it's going to be quite difficult. Okay, so in terms of foils, then we have the working class cleaner, the woman whose husband has deserted her, the woman now who has to fend for 7 children and 2 on the way, Mrs. Johnston. So her foil then, essentially, or contrast, would be Mrs. Lyons. And Mrs. Lyons then, of course, is a middle class woman. So her husband is quite a successful businessman. He's often away on work or away for work. So obviously that's very, very important in terms of the plot, then how she's able to conceal certain details from him. So basically then she is the middle class woman who lives in a large house, and essentially then it's very important that she doesn't have any children of her own. So she and her husband then are unable to have children, and that sort of sets in motion then the domino effect when it comes to the plot and then when it comes to the tragic outcome of the play itself. Okay, so that's Mrs. Johnson and Mrs. Lyons. And Mrs. Lyons essentially, of course, can be quite patronising and quite condescending when it comes to Mrs. Johnson. She could also be quite manipulative. Even from the very beginning of the play, there are sort of hints that perhaps she can be quite treacherous or devious. All is not as it appears to be when it comes to Mrs. Lyons. Okay, so remember that Mrs. Johnson then is the biological mother of the twins, whereas Mrs. Lyons then is the adoptive mother of the twins. Sorry, I should say the adoptive mother then, of course, of Edward. And even when we're looking at the characters' names in terms of Mickey and Edward, you automatically assume then that Mickey is the working class kid, and then that Edward is the middle class kid. Because think about it, Mickey is kind of casual, informal as such. There's a hint of kind of childishness about it. Then Edward, when you kind of think about it, is associated with royalty. So we kind of think about, of course, that their names actually reflect then their backgrounds and their rearing in terms of the 2 different mothers and the 2 different locations. And then obviously, of course, their trajectories are vastly different in terms of the fact, of course, that Edward obviously ends up going to college and becoming a counsellor. And then we have Mickey, of course, who goes to the local school and unfortunately ends up going to prison. Okay, so remember that we have 2 acts when it comes to Blood Brothers. So obviously at the very beginning we're introduced then to Mrs. Johnson, and I'll go through her introduction in some detail then during the next class. We're going to focus really on Mrs. Johnson and her background and the narrator, and how the narrator then plays 2 different characters. So we have the milkman and we have the gynecologist, and then we have the interaction between Mrs. Johnson and Mrs. Lyons, and that's going to be a pivotal scene then at the very beginning of Act 1. And then it's emphasising essentially the difference between Mickey and Edward. Okay, so quite a lot of tension, conflict then created in terms of the conversation, the pivotal conversation that ensues between Mrs. Johnson and Mrs. Lyons, where Mrs. Lyons suggests to Mrs. Johnson then, of course, that she adopts one of the children. Okay, so Mickey and Edward then are the protagonists. They are the tragic heroes, essentially, too. So who else do we have in this particular story or plot? We also have Sammy then, who is Mickey's older brother, because remember, of course, that there are 7 other children before him. We also then have Linda, who is a friend initially, and then provides a source of tension and conflict between the 2 brothers, okay, where she is married, of course, to Mickey, but she ends up having an affair with Edward, and that leads, of course, to the tragedy then at the end of the play. We also have Mr. Lyons, who's a kind of peripheral character, kind of fleeting essentially. So he's more important in terms of his role and in terms of the plot. He's not fully fleshed out essentially there as such. Okay, so those are the main characters. Okay. And what we're going to do, I think, the next day is then we're going to focus on the very beginning of Act 1. In terms of the plot, I mean, okay, there are twists and turns, but it's quite a linear plot and it's quite straightforward. And it's only really at the beginning, of course, that we're forced to focus on the theme of fate or destiny, because we know that both boys die. Okay, we have that kind of reenactment at the very, very beginning, and then we have to try and work out exactly how the plot is going to lead us to the inevitable conclusion of the tragic deaths of the Blood brothers as such. And then we kind of think back to the title and we sort of think of, okay, blood in terms of what they share, in terms of the fact that they are biological brothers, but also the idea of bloodshed is implied in the title as well. So even their deaths is kind of predicted in the title of the play, The Blood Brothers. There will be bloodshed by the end of the play. There will be blood, essentially. So the violence and the tragedy and the hurt and the suffering is implied then, even before we begin reading the play, as in the script or book, or indeed watching the musical as well. Now, when you're actually watching the musical, I mean, think about it, it's not all doom and gloom because there's a lot of humour there. And if you think about it, that kind of gritty sort of humour, and we say that there are quite a lot of puns and so on as well, kind of vulgarities, all of that kind of relates back to a typical sort of Scouse sense of humour. And I'll talk more about that when we're looking at the key or opening scene then the next day. Okay, so hopefully you've got a good sense basically of the kind of the setting and also what the stage should look like at the very beginning and who our main characters are. Obviously, we're going to be focusing on Mickey and Edward in terms of character, okay, so in terms of traits, but also characterization, how the characters are actually depicted by Willy Russell, the dramatist himself. Okay, so just consider those particular points for the next day. And as I said, make sure you get a little bit of the reading done and make sure that you watch the musical as well, because there's no point in just sitting there and kind of reading the script. You really have to see what it looks like on stage and maybe think about how you would do certain things differently. You know, are there any particular, we say, aspects of the lighting or maybe costume, or in terms, we'd say, of the characters on stage and how they're depicted by the actors? How would you make any changes? How would you adapt it differently, essentially, from the script itself? Okay, talk to you soon, guys. Take care.